Hello, everyone. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ESN, and I'm here to welcome everyone to this important event, an expert roundtable conversation about economic nationalism and energy security. I don't need to tell this audience why we think this is one of the big issues around nationalism that need our attention. The link between nationalism and economics has become obvious during the last few years, during which people around the world have experienced multiple crises, the global pandemic, the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine, all of which have implications for economies from a global level to state policy to sub-state governments, municipal governments, NGOs providing services to marginalized people. So all of this is linked to various versions of nationalism in a world structured around the nation state, where state governments remain primarily responsible for responding to these challenges, and governments have been responding in diverse ways. There is a trend, however, that looks like economic nationalism, protectionist policies framed in defense of national interests. And at the same time, there's also a broad consensus among neoliberal actors that economic nationalism interferes with market forces. And progressive political actors worry about another consequence of economic nationalism, that it reinforces exclusionary policies and attitudes. So all of this affects people around the world in different regions. Of course, ESN focuses mostly on Europe and Eurasia, but one of the missions of virtual ESN has been to open up and broaden the scope of the conversation. And I am thankful to Professor Peter Rutland from Wesleyan University for organizing and moderating a conversation today about these issues with two leading experts in the field who are looking at these questions from a more global perspective. Natalie, Koch, Professor of Human Geography at Heidelberg University in Germany, and Professor Andreas Pickel, Professor of Global Politics at Trent University, Canada. Their short bios will be posted in the chat. I'm going to give the virtual floor over to Professor Peter Rutland now, who is Professor of Government at Wesleyan University. He's also Vice President of ESN, and he was Editor-in-Chief of the ESN Scholarly Journal Nationalities Papers for many years. And his work has also been essential for the well-being of virtual ESN. And so I'm going to give it over to you, Peter, and then I'll disappear and then come back at the end to thank the panel.
Great, thank you, Zsuzsa. I'm very pleased to have two real authorities in this field to talk to us today. And Andreas Pickel has been working this subject for many years. He's the author with Eric Helleiner of a pivotal book, Economic Nationalism in a Globalizing World from 2006. And before that, he did a lot of work on East Germany and the transition in Eastern Europe. And he's the editor of a forthcoming book from Edward Elgar, The Handbook of Economic Nationalism, which reviews trends in economic nationalism all around the world. And Natalie, Koch, and I both have chapters in that forthcoming volume, which we're eager to see. And Professor Koch recently moved to Heidelberg after 10 years at Syracuse. She's the editor of a book, Critical Geopolitics of Sport, in 2017, the author of a book, The Geopolitics of Spectacle, Space, Synecdoche, and the New Capitals of Asia, based on her dissertation work in Central Asia. And she's also broadened now to the Middle East and is author of a forthcoming book, Arid Empire, The Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia. So the format will be each speaker will speak for about 12 minutes each. I'll make some comments and then we'll open it up to questions. And please post your questions, audience members, in the Q&A. And so without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Professor Pickel.
Thank you very much, Peter, for those introductory remarks. I thought I'd provide our audience with just a very brief sketch of the economic nationalism context. We're talking about resource energy nationalism today, and that's really itself, it's a type of economic nationalism. Now, economic nationalism, it's important to stress, is a form of nationalism, not just a particular set of policies. And I'm just going to repeat that because it's really key. Economic nationalism is a form of nationalism, not just a particular set of policies. Economic nationalism, more broadly, is about the effects of nationalism on the economy, but also the effects of the economy on the nation. Now, a nation is an imagined community based in a national culture. Nationalism is the use and development of this culture in all spheres of society. So this is a very broad-based conception of nationalism that, however, I believe corresponds to its real power. Organizations, groups, individuals are the carriers or agents of national culture. These agents have explicit national identities, even if at the same time they are often unaware of the degree to which they are shaped implicitly by their national culture. The most important social system for nations and nationalism is the modern territorial state. All states claim to represent a nation, even if they are, as many state societies are today, multinational. Now, key to understanding how nationalism works at the macro level of economy and society is the structure of the international state system. States are linked to each other in political terms. In the simplest terms, friends, foes, or ignorables. The main mechanism in the international state system is power. Military, political, economic, technological, cultural, and biosocial power. This power is held unequally among states. For the global system, perhaps 5 states really matter, and about 20 matter much more than the rest. This is, of course, in power terms. The bipolar block structure of the international state system after the Second World War has been replaced with a dominant state structure. The US, as the dominant state, has been declining in power vis-a-vis other states, except, of course, in military terms. US global dominance is being increasingly challenged in all respects by China. So let's look at some at different nationalisms at this current juncture in history. Since the 1990s, US nationalism internationally has been expansionary. US financial nationalism, the creation of a liberalized global financial system, has been a great success. US military nationalism, on the other hand, has at best a mixed record. The desire of former Soviet bloc countries to join the US-led military alliance of NATO, has advanced US expansionary nationalism without great cost compared to other expansionary ventures of recent times. Now, after an extended period of political division, Ukrainian pro-Western, anti-Russian nationalism has become the dominant form of Ukrainian nationalism over the past decade. The prospect of Ukraine as a member of the EU and possibly NATO motivated the Russian regime to take over Crimea and support pro-Russian separatist groups in Ukraine's Donbas region. Over the past decade, Russian nationalism, forever torn between so-called Westernizers and Slavophiles, has become dominated by anti-US and generally anti-Western sentiment. Notwithstanding extensive economic ties, Russia's failure to achieve an acceptable security settlement with the West led Putin first to threaten and then carry out the military invasion of Ukraine. So Russia opted for aggressive military nationalism. Ukrainian nationalism has decisively turned into a kind of anti-colonial nationalism, a defensive military nationalism that is so far generously and unconditionally supported by most Western governments. And this is perhaps the most important unintended and irreversible consequence of Russia's aggressive nationalism for the global order. For Ukraine, it means a guarantee for far-reaching Western integration. Now let's look a bit at the nationalisms of EU countries, which prior to the Russian invasion were clearly not anti-Russian. EU nationalisms were not anti-Russian, and to some extent, they were critical of US foreign policy. Now, with Russia's military invasion, EU nationalisms were reconfigured in short order around containing the threat of Russian military aggression on European soil. The geographical and cultural proximity of Ukraine gave rise to a spontaneous nationalism of grassroots solidarity. Millions of Ukrainian refugees have found shelter above all in Poland and Germany. The economic effects of this new anti-Russian nationalism in the West, especially of course in the form of the far-reaching sanctions regime, have turned out to be very costly and painful for most European countries. As a result, each country has been forced to embrace its own economic nationalism in order to protect their populations and industries from the consequences of a mounting energy crisis. So we can observe specific German, Italian, French, Hungarian, etc., economic nationalisms being activated in response to the unanticipated and therefore unintended consequences of the new anti-Russian nationalism. So political nationalism in these European countries and economic nationalism do not align. Unintended or not, US anti-Russian nationalism offers the country, I think, a welcome break from its frustrating competition with China. US foreign policy makers are willing to help Ukraine fight the good fight at significant cost to the US taxpayer, but in the hopes of fundamentally weakening Russia and possibly bringing about regime change. The recent midterm elections may reduce the size of support for Ukraine in the near future. US anti-Russian nationalism has also some welcome effects on the sale of energy to its European partners. And whether that's intended or not, it is an instance of successful economic nationalism, US economic nationalism, at a high cost for its European allies. So I think I'm gonna stop there for now.
Thank you, Andreas, for a great overview in a broad historical and geographical context. And we've got plenty to talk about. I'll move on to Dr. Koch.
Thank you. I had hoped to share my screen, but the host has disabled it. Might I? All right, wonderful. So yes, thank you for the invitation to be here. What I want to talk about today also is a bit more specific, more case study specific than Andreas's comments here, but I think it sort of brings us to the impetus for these conversations about energy and nationalism in the wake of the current situation and ongoing war in Ukraine. One of the things that sort of strikes me about this moment is that it feels exceptional, but it's not entirely original or unique. So there's then sort of this sense of this resurgence of economic nationalism. I think if anything, we simply see it in a new form with a new flavor to it. And what I really still see coming out of the developments in the wake of the war and the energy situation in Europe right now is a sort of continuation of this broader pattern that we've seen in the contemporary era of globalization, of these sort of mutually reinforcing economic nationalisms. So I'll just sort of give you a few examples of what I mean by that by looking at the European case. So here I've put energy crisis in quotes because yes, there is a really big sense of urgency to deal with the high energy costs, shortages in Europe, and this started from the very beginning of the most recent invasion of Ukraine in February. But as you can see from this tracker from Reuters, the gas stores in Europe are mostly full since 2 days ago. That we don't necessarily have this immediate sense of urgency at the moment. It looks like the European countries, the EU countries, have been able to shore up their supplies, and this was the big concern at the beginning, whether or not there would be sufficient gas to get through the winter. Overall, though, some of this has been the acquisition of gas supplies in advance of a perceived crisis, but there have also been a number of initiatives across Germany in the last month where in federal buildings, for example, we have to keep the temperatures below a certain level. We're not allowed to use sort of types of heated water. There's a number of conservation initiatives that have been brought out as well. And here I think this sort of gives you a sense of how this idea of nationalism is also working to mobilize citizen activity on the energy front, even though I think some of the most important and significant issues that we see with the sort of practice of economic nationalism in response to the energy situation is at the government level, at the top policy level. But if we sort of take crisis in with a grain of salt, it looks like maybe things will be okay. That doesn't necessarily mean it will be in the future. There's still a huge amount of anxiety across Europe about how things will look on the other side. But I also want to just consider a different placement of those quotation marks, and specifically a European energy crisis, because where we have seen this sort of this ability of the EU countries to fill those gas stores, other parts of the world are dealing with major cuts, and they are not able to get gas on the international market simply because prices are too high. Supplies are just not what they could be. So there's this sort of narrative that I've heard from people outside of Europe that, well, yes, Europe is going to do fine, but we in the global South, we don't have any ability to compete with the Germans, for example, who've gone out and really negotiated these gas deals internationally. And that's exactly what I, as somebody focusing primarily actually on the Gulf countries, have been really interested in seeing. Some of the very first actions of the German government in response to the war were to go visit the Gulf countries, and you also had a number of Gulf leaders coming to Germany. So the picture on the top there was Sheikh Tamim from Qatar. That one is in Germany. So there were a number of visits back and forth. And this kind of bilateral energy diplomacy is an important part of understanding how this economic nationalism is playing out. So you can see the EU flag sort of flying in these meetings. But this is really, these sorts of actions on the part of the German government, they're very much interested in Germany's industry, Germany's energy needs. And that sort of comes at the front. So you have this continuation of this energy and resource and economic nationalism all sort of coming together here, where this is also then mutually reinforcing the nationalist stories of places like Qatar, where there has long been a narrative of resource nationalism and the idea that Qatar is the largest, has the largest gas reserves in the world, and that so many other parts of the world are dependent on the country for its gas. And so this sort of very, very quick effort to negotiate these deals has given added sort of value to that story from the Gulf elites, who are saying that they are that they are new and valuable partners to Germany. So to go back to this really quickly, I think the other interesting piece of this here, though, is that Scholz and Habeck have been meeting not just with the Qataris, right? Because the Qataris have the most gas. They've also been meeting with the Saudis and the Emiratis. And the Saudis and the Emiratis also have gas, not as significant amounts, but many of their conversations have actually been focused more on hydrogen energy. And hydrogen is this I arrived in Germany in March just as the war was starting, and I was really astounded at how loud these conversations about hydrogen were in Germany. There's a very strong sense that this is sort of the fuel of the future. It's going to solve all these energy woes, and the German government has been investing a huge amount into developing its hydrogen industry. As an American, I've sort of puzzled over why exactly this is. I've kind of come away from it with a sense that there is a lot of optimistic thinking that this can really be the kind of energy that is needed for an industry-heavy country. But I think there's also just a strong sense that that getting Germany out in front of this conversation on hydrogen is going to benefit the country economically long into the future. So they're trying to focus on being the first and starting to kickstart that. And that is exactly already then a strong idea of economic nationalism and a kind of resource nationalism that isn't necessarily domestic based, because they have been focusing on a hydrogen diplomacy project of trying to get other parts of the world to cooperate with them on exactly this effort to develop hydrogen. I think I am getting the time warning here, so I will quickly move to close here. So as you can see, the German government has been sort of working to build these partnerships with other parts of the world, including the UAE. This is where I've been really focusing my work on the hydrogen topic, and working together by developing these new hydrogen partnerships. And there's a very strong idea that this is kind of the future of German and Emirati relations. And this is where we have that sort of mutually reinforcing economic nationalism here, that if we can work together, the Emiratis can get their gas being made quote unquote more sustainable per the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and Germany can also secure these future supplies of hydrogen, and all, of course, with the background being that this is having major effects on gas supplies and the ability of other parts of the world to access those. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Both speakers were scrupulously within the loose limit. I'll just make a few comments, and then we'll invite audience members to post questions on the Q&A part of the Zoom website. So starting off in reaction to Andreas's comments, yes, geoeconomics and geopolitics are back in play, but of course they never went away, as you point out. The United States had a very consistent and far-reaching geoeconomic strategy and geopolitical strategy during the Cold War and after the Cold War. And one of the kind of conceits of neoliberalism was that those two weren't connected, that there were the politics and economics were kind of separate, right? That economics was just technical and win-win, and the politics is something separate and it's kind of constraint or an obstacle that the economics have to work around. But the reality is, I think that geopolitics and geoeconomics are two sides of the same coin, albeit with different actors at national and international level. Now, on the Russian side, they were kind of knocked out of the game for a while, sat on the bench in the 1990s, but they're coming back both geoeconomically and geopolitically. And the Germans are discovering now to their cost in terms of 4 times higher energy bills that the Russians were using economics as a weapon. I myself was kind of skeptical about this over the years. I was thinking Gazprom is just a business. They're just trying to loot as much money as they can for their own directors. And they've used economic weapon a little bit against Ukraine, against Belarus, against Lithuania. But what we've seen in the past 18 months or so is a massive weaponization of Russian gas. In terms of, I'm pretty sure that Putin went into this war, the February invasion, convinced that Germany and Europe would not respond because they couldn't afford to survive the next winter without Russian gas. And we saw, going back to summer of 2021, the Russians depleting the gas storage in Europe in preparation. Now we can see clearly for the war that was about to come, or the occupation as they hoped to do it. Now, Russia as a geopolitical player is more limited in scope. I think despite their action in Syria, I see Russia's geopolitical ambitions confined to the Eurasian zone, and I see the Ukraine war primarily as a war for territory around the Black Sea and the port of Sevastopol. But Putin thought that the geoeconomics of the energy weapon against Europe and the geopolitics of having a 1 million-man army well-equipped that could roll into Ukraine, whose economy is 10 times smaller than Russia, and whose military arsenal is also 10 times weaker than Russia without nuclear weapons. He thought it was going to be very easy, and it turns out not to be. One question I have for Andreas is this question of, he mentioned at one point that there's misalignment between the political and economic nationalism, and I was wondering what you have in mind there. I'm guessing that perhaps you meant the Europeans are politically united across different countries in opposing Russia, but the national economic responses are different and somewhat competing. Natalie also mentioned the question of mutually reinforcing nationalism. I think this is a very interesting path to go, because you have the politics and economics at national level, and then you have the politics and economics at international level. And to some extent, these crises, first COVID, which led to more fragmentation, and now the Ukraine war, which maybe is leading to a more unified approach, both in the politics and maybe in the economics. So this is why nationalism is back with such force, because countries are emulating each other, they're copying each other, they're learning from each other, and if they're doing it, we can do it. So I see that synergy between the economics and politics. It's a cliche that crisis brings opportunity, but it forces countries to readjust. And I think Natalie's analysis of Germany's hydrogen strategy is a fascinating example of that forward-looking response. At the domestic level, again, on this question of the synergy between the politics and economics of nationalism, I think we've seen, certainly in Russia and Ukraine, the old cliche of rally around the flag effect coming into play. And we saw this in Russia already in March 2014, when Putin's approval rating jumped to 20 points from 60 to 80% in 1 month after the annexation of Crimea. And up to that point, for the previous 14 years, Putin's approval rating had pretty closely tracked the economic growth and living standards. Since 2014, those two lines on the graph have parted company, and whether the economy recovers or crashes, Putin's approval rating has stayed pretty constant. And I think that's an example of this rally around the flag effect. And we certainly see that in Ukraine, where Zelensky was pretty unpopular by the end of 2021 with like a 15% approval. And now he seems to be phenomenally popular and respected around the world and within Ukraine. I'm not sure to what extent we see rally around the flag effect in different countries. We don't really see it in the US. We certainly don't see it in the UK, where they've revolved leaders faster than you can count. Maybe Macron's re-election is partly a rally around the flag effect. I'd be interested to hear your comments. Final point I'll make is, just to reiterate on the rally around the flag effect, what we're talking about is a trade-off, right? That pride in your country or fear in your country's physical security trumps other calculations. So you're prepared, you, the electorate, you, the individual, are prepared to take some economic pain, such as a 400% rise in your energy bills, in return for, in this case, supporting Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. So that's the kind of economics of the rally around the flag effect, is a willingness to accept pain in your living standards. So the final question or point I would make is the question of short-term and long-term. And I think Dr. Koch is right that the Europeans have positioned themselves well for this winter, despite the price hike. But the problem is going to be next winter and future winters. So it's the kind of, can they sustain paying those prices for gas and electricity for years to come? That will have such a recessionary effect on their economies that the political coalition in favor of that belt tightening may erode. And with respect to the Qataris, or for that matter, to the US gas fracking industry, my impression is that the industry is holding off on long-term investments because they've been burned by the boom bust of oil prices and gas prices so often in the past. So I think they're looking for 10 or even 20-year guaranteed price take or pay contracts before they create that extra capacity to drill for natural gas and build LNG facilities to export it to Europe. So I think, and this point is directly related to Putin's own calculation. I think Putin is playing a war of attrition now, and he's hoping that the Western coalition will fall apart because of this long-term energy shortage, energy price. And while I'm kind of optimistic in the short run for this winter, I'm not sure I see the future supplies coming on stream fast enough before the human and economic costs that are being borne by Ukraine and its Western partners become politically unbearable. So I don't know if Andreas or Natalie, if you want to respond to any of those.
Well, go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly do a short comment about the natural gas supply question. And this is where the hydrogen issue is key, because while they've been talking about doing green hydrogen in the future, the focus right now is on gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen, which is gray is using natural gas, blue hydrogen is using natural gas, but attached to carbon capture and utilization systems. So if they can get this whole hydrogen system up and running, there will be a very large supply or a very large demand for gas supply going forward. So I think that's where the long-term question about the gas demand is actually a very interesting one, and why the Gulf gas producers are really jumping on that one. So stop there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andreas.
Yeah, I think we're talking about rather different dimensions of nationalism. You are at a very much more concrete level, and my point that I wanted to make is that nationalism is always around. Now, it's not always in the same form, but nationalism is always there. It is there by definition because we have national cultures in this world that are fenced in by territorial states. So in that sense, when the US in the 1990s went about liberalizing the global financial system, in my terms, that is an instance of financial nationalism. Because like England in the 19th century, liberalism and neoliberalism can benefit your society, your country, and so that pursuing it on a global level, of course, makes sense. Another important dimension is that nationalism has an arrow below and one going up. The arrow below is the national culture, is what society talks about, thinks, what people find important, what is typical for a country, and so on. That is the national culture. A government is the other side. A government, of course, has to deal with a range of specific governance questions, but it has to legitimate itself and does so with reference to the national culture. And let me just maybe clarify this or illustrate this in the German case. I suggested that political nationalism and economic nationalism don't line up in that case. By political nationalism, I mean that Germany used to be really in the post-Soviet period quite a cooperative and positive partner of Russia. This was its political nationalism. It was something that also Chancellor Merkel pursued, and that she's still holding on and defending at this point, when the rest of society, the press, the media, and government have all discovered that Russia was bad from the beginning, and that perhaps even the policy of détente in the early 70s may have already been the source of the problem. I'm exaggerating here a bit, but the economic nationalism of Germany is to get its economy developing further, to deal with its particular problems, especially with respect to the climate crisis, with respect to technological progress. And Germany, by embracing this political nationalism that the United States has been leading, and Germany has incurred huge costs for its economy and, of course, for the people. Not for everyone, but there may be enough gas there, but 20–30% of the population will not be able to afford it. there are different levels, of course, at which this plays out. But so in terms of a defensible economic nationalism, Germany's jump onto the extreme sanctions vote has led to has shot itself in the foot very, very badly. Interestingly, the population has been quite willing to go along with that, because the population was surprised, and very soon after the invasion, the Chancellor Scholz indicated that Germany is about to reorient fundamentally. He announced 100 billion euros for the military and so on. Germans actually embraced the pro-Ukrainian political nationalism very strongly. Though I should say, West Germans did. In fact, East Germans, and there's very interesting documentation on this, East Germans in large part are not on board with German foreign policy towards Russia at this point. They do not agree with it at all. They have a much different view and history with Russia. So this is what I mean by the not aligning, but you can't, economic and political nationalism just belong together. You can't, you can analytically distinguish them, but in reality, if politically you say you're the number one enemy, and economically that means you're not getting any more gas, then that doesn't align. This is not about whether that's justifiable or not, but this is just the kind of what develops as a result of the complexity of nationalism issues. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, now it's very clear. Yes, go ahead, Natalie. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the contemporary scripts of nationalism within Germany is that you have a very strong thread of contemporary German nationalism, which is about sustainability and building this green energy future. So to be a proper good environmental citizen is an important part of that identity narrative in Germany increasingly today. And so I think where Andreas is pointing at these different kind of scripts of nationalism within Germany, what has been very interesting is, yes, there has been very much a sort of rally around the Ukrainian flag in Germany for many reasons. Separate, but maybe also attached to that is then this narrative that the war and this whole energy crisis is going to be that jolt that Germany needs to finally transition to this alternative energy future. And so I think you have this fusing of that pro-Ukraine narrative and seeing Germany as being sort of the supportive country and the patriotic stories coming out of that, but also then together with the energy leader and forward-looking sustainable identity, those are coming together, and I think that's helping perpetuate that in a particular way. And of course, that sort of environmental nationalism in the German broader discourse is much more dominant, like it's stronger in West Germany than I think in East Germany, or at least the environmentalism takes a different tone in Eastern Germany. So I think it's kind of that fusion of those two scripts that helps explain a lot of that German support as well.
In Russia, I would say the asymmetry is a kind of mirror image of what's happened in Germany, in that the economic dependence of Russia on European economies was very high, 50% of their trade was with the European Union, and even a higher proportion of their energy exports. And some of those energy exports can be switched to other customers, China and India, but those pipelines cannot be moved overnight. I mean, the pipeline oil and pipeline gas is going to be kind of lost forever, and it'll take them 10 years to build new pipelines to China, and it's not clear it's economically viable. So, and there's limits to the tanker capacity to make up for that loss. So while Russia is disengaging economically from Europe, something that Putin did not anticipate, because he didn't anticipate these kind of blanket sanctions. At the same time, the politics of Russia is becoming even more exclusionary of Europe, and the kind of anti-Western mentality and the militarization of the state and society has reached extreme levels. So Russia's kind of also politically disengaging from the West much faster than it's able to disengage economically from the West. And presumably those two will come into alignment in the future, but that's only going to happen with a much more shrunken Russian economy. Now, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So they kind of go together. One question is, what is the impact of all of these developments on democracy versus autocracy? Which regime type is more compatible with this resurgence of economic nationalism? And then secondly, more specifically, the role of welfare spending and the kind of social market economy model that has been under strain for decades. Is this turn of events going to make it more or less important that the state intervenes to preserve living standards of the unfortunate? I don't know if Andreas want to tackle those questions.
Well, let me just, I have to say something about the old distinction between democracy and authoritarian regimes. And I find it singularly unhelpful to really analyze anything. Of course, for ideologues, this distinction is extremely important. This is one that, of course, has been pushed by the German government in order to get the population to support weapons and other help for the Ukrainians. And you know, this is part of ideological imagery. What's behind it is, of course, you can see that it is just that. When you see that, as Natalie has outlined, after rejecting Russia, in part, of course, because of the war, but also autocratic country and so on, they move begging really to these Arab countries that are not peace-loving countries. Saudi Arabia, of course, as is widely known, but certainly not universally, is fighting itself a war on the peninsula, supported by the United States in Yemen, and that war is in no sense anything less than what is happening in the Ukraine. What I'm saying is this is power politics. It has nothing to do with authoritarianism or democracy. Just like the United States, I think ultimately Europeans also don't really care what it is, unless at the moment they're involved in it ideologically. And I'm not sure that that Europe is necessarily making the right investments for the future, for its economic future, though, Natalie, hopefully, and I've thought about this too, as an unintended consequence, it may be that alternative energy developments will be pushed forward. That is possible, but authoritarianism or democracy, I mean, are we defending, I always find this funny after, watching US democracy and what goes on there, both internally and externally. And approaching this as if democracy is sort of the good side and then authoritarianism is the bad side. I think we should be way beyond that as analysts. This is for ideologues, and it is, conveniently misleading.
But powerfully so. I mean, and I think this is what has always interested me in studying authoritarianism, is simply how that sort of Western construction of the authoritarian others is a particular narrative about the self. And here, yeah, you can also see how economic regimes kind of come into that categorization of the good liberal free market and the bad authoritarian closed state controlled market. And I think this is actually, I didn't have a chance to speak in my presentation about the German nationalization of the gas company Uniper. And this is one of those pieces where you start to see then the idea of state ownership of these energy companies as something that was often demonized in the Gulf countries, because Saudi Aramco is Saudi state owned, as with all of the other major oil and gas companies across the Gulf region. So those big domestic oil and gas firms, that's something normal, but it's often been stigmatized as a sign for authoritarian otherness. Obviously, that's not necessarily an accurate characterization, but it's something that comes into those stories, and which then also makes it interesting to see how that justification for these cooperation efforts and agreements with the Gulf countries has been justified within Germany, because they know there's an image problem, right? And this is something where, plenty of people have very openly pointed out, well, you're just going from the Russian autocrats to the Qatari autocrats, and that then gets pushed into a broader story about new climate futures, new energy futures, and the future kind of becomes this place to be colonized with this wonderful imagination of moving beyond the political system of today. And so this is where you can start to see how the idea of the future becomes operationalized as a justification for those policies that skirt around that authoritarian democratic divide. I agree with Andreas completely. I mean, from the theoretical abstract position, authoritarian and democratic regimes, they have a lot more in common than we often like to pretend. But at the same time, that division still becomes a discursive resource as the regimes have to justify their actions, and as the EU has to justify its actions, or conveniently ignoring certain things like the war in Yemen that Andreas also aptly brings up.
Well, I actually disagree with Andreas on this one. I mean, I agree 100% about the hypocrisy of turning to the Gulf regimes, but it's hypocrisy precisely because the distinction between autocracy and democracy does have some substantive content and meaning. That's why it's hypocrisy, because we're proclaiming democracy but helping to bankroll autocracies in that region. And I think Russia has tragically changed the regime over the past 10 years, and especially since February 24th. It's become a much harsher autocratic regime. And many of my friends and former colleagues have had to flee the country. And 4,000 people have been arrested for discrediting the Russian military. So those are not ideological abstractions. Those are real people whose lives are being ruined as a byproduct of this war. Now, the interesting question to me is what's going to happen in Ukraine, because Ukraine is fighting to defend its sovereignty, and it also is a democracy, certainly more democratic than Russia has been in recent years. But we don't know what the post-war Ukraine is going to look like, because Ukraine's democracy pre-war was not terribly robust. It was not effective functioning state. It did have electoral turnover and somewhat free and fair elections, and a lot of personal freedom. So it passes the democratic threshold, but that was pre-war. We don't know what the effect of the war will be. The devastation it's been experiencing, the role of the military will be very influential in the post-war Ukraine, as is true in any post-Civil War situation. And so I'm worried that, yes, I do agree with Andreas to the extent that ideology can use rhetorically the authoritarian democratic distinction. And we got carried away in portraying Ukraine perhaps as a paragon of democracy, and we don't know what the future will bring. So on that front, I'm kind of partly agreeing with Andreas. We do have a question about Turkey from Mara Akopian, asking about Turkey's role in all of this, and in particular, Turkey, of course, has not joined the sanctions. On the contrary, it's stepping up its role as a transit route for gas from Russia to Europe. So our panelists are invited to comment on Turkey's role, and is Russia using Turkey just to try to make money, or is there also a political goal of trying to kind of peel off the Balkan countries and Italy by providing them with gas via Turkey?
I would, if I can start, I would ask the question from the viewpoint of Turkey. I mean, it's about Turkey, not about Russia and whether Russia can somehow, find an ally in Turkey, or I mean, why is Turkey's political nationalism as it is? The answer is because Turkey has been sidelined as well by the West, and it is not Turkey. It has been rejected basically by the European Union, and it does not feel any obligation of the kinds that the European countries feel towards the Ukraine, and of course, ironically, Turkey is also a NATO member and has the ability to use its membership as a way of extracting concessions from Sweden, from Finland, who want to join. So I think it's I said there's a bit of a problem if we don't look at the nationalisms of all the countries involved and what is going on there and what is their situation, why do they behave in a particular way. And all countries have their own national ideas and goals that are not Western necessarily, or Chinese, but we tend to very quickly slot them in that way. Are they for us or against us? How come South Africa is not more anti-Russian? That as an example. Okay.
Yeah, I agree that Turkey is an independent player, and Erdogan seems to be benefiting politically from this crisis, because he's played his cards very well in helping to broker prisoner exchanges and helping to broker the grain deal, which is very important for global South food importing countries. And so I'm not sure how that will play out domestically in Turkey, but presumably it's helping to boost Erdogan's popularity, because he's been a very effective leader on the global stage at a time when his party's popularity was falling. So I guess this plays into our kind of general argument about the crisis reinforcing political nationalism, because Erdogan definitely falls into the category of a nationalist leader, and he does bridge the autocracy-democracy divide. I don't know, Natalie, if you want to chime in on this topic?
Yeah, I guess to me the big thing that we see with Erdogan and any of the other big international leaders that we've been talking about is that basically all of them are opportunists. Erdogan, perhaps in this moment, we see that more clearly. Putin, I suppose we've always known that he's an opportunist. But if there's the opportunity to use a particular situation to bolster their credentials, economic development of their country, whatever that might be, then the war has created a lot of opportunities for actors who want to position themselves as brokers as such. What I think is interesting then about the idea of nationalism here is that I always sort of think about and teach about in my classes nationalism as a kind of resource. And so what you see then in this particular case is the application of that nationalist script about building up Turkey's international profile and applying that then to these opportunistic moves. Right. So this to me is how I would sort of read the issue of Turkey's involvement in these in the recent sort of diplomatic efforts. I would also mention, since we are so we've sort of hit on some of these issues that are being neglected when we focus on the Ukraine conflict, is that there's also a very important, significant conflict happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the war in Ukraine has very much complicated those relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Turkey is involved in that. So there, I think, again, I don't want to say it's a straight bait and switch, but if you're looking at how then the economic nationalism and other kinds of nationalism are being used in Erdogan's activities, that's also then helping keep your attention there on the quote unquote positive sides of the story, rather than the sort of punitive side of it, which would be their involvement also in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, of course, we saw similar complications with the Tajik-Uzbek border conflicts, and Russia not. It was never a very effective broker in that region, and it's even more distracted now in the midst of the Ukraine war. There was a question earlier about welfare statism and how the Ukraine crisis and energy crisis affects the kind of social market economy model. And my own impression is it's COVID and the intervention by governments to protect businesses and revive the economy, that kind of broke some of the taboos about government intervention in the economy. And that interventionist policy is kind of carried over into the energy crisis. So we have like the Conservative government in Britain, capping energy bills for consumers for the next 6 months. So I think kind of the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, that there's a political desire to maintain social safety nets, but the money isn't there, kind of the capacity to prevent declining living standards in the advanced European economies, or the US for that matter, is just not there. I don't know if either of the panelists wants to pick that one up.
Yeah, I mean that would
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree, Peter. I mean, I think that would be my sense of it as well. Is it right now it's difficult to predict, but I really truly don't see the outlook being very positive for keeping things up. I mean, it's really astonishing, even just to listen to, being now at a German university, how much of a hit the energy bills are taking on the university budget. I mean, it's really astonishing. So on that side, yeah, I'm really not sure how long it can be sustained. I think there's just sort of a wishful thinking right now that it will all just be good when we wake up in 2023, and the war will be over, and everything will be fine. So yes, there probably needs to be and there should be increased support, but there likely won't be the money. To this, I would also sort of add a footnote, because I am from the United States, from a proper garrison state, where social welfare spending is military spending, frankly. That is something I see is really fascinating, with just that immediate jump to put a lot of money into the German military. I mean, that's as Andreas pointed out before, just an astonishing about face on this issue within Germany. So maybe we can all be happy that the social spending will be going via the military channels, as in the sort of U.S. garrison state model. Who knows?
I would just briefly add that, there's no social market model in general. We really have to look at the individual countries, and as we've mentioned with respect to Germany, Germany has a lot of money available, and they can always take care of these. Up to, so far, they have been. Many other countries, and not just in the South, have never had that kind of capacity to provide, to broaden welfare, to broaden expensive initiatives for which they have to borrow money on the international capital markets. I mean, that's the normal story, I think. And welfare is sort of the welfare state regime is perhaps, or this model is something that is from the post-war era, post-Second World War era. In some places like the United States, it's never been that important, and it's really a European thing. I would suggest, and of course, it's also something that has been undermined over the past 20 years. During the neoliberal age, which has always erred on the side of reducing social expenditure, and that's even true in Germany. Those are still you can still see the consequences of those reforms, those neoliberal reforms by the Social Democrats in 2005-06. So if you have the money, you're okay. If you don't, you were always already suffering. There's nothing new, putting it a bit bluntly.
Yeah, I'm not sure things are that bleak. I mean, in Mexico and Brazil, they had quite effective poverty reduction programs. The Bolsa Familia in Brazil, and with Lula getting re-elected, we may see more progress on that front. I think we're kind of drawing to a close now, so I would invite our distinguished panelists, if you have any closing thoughts, now is the time to share them.
I would just quickly reiterate, I mean, I think that economic nationalism has always been with us. And when I was thinking about how to reflect on this moment, what exactly is different, we do see the sort of spectacle of sovereignty being performed in an exceptional way in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. But I really think that, yeah, economic nationalism has always been around, and what comes of that for the next years will be also a bigger story of economic nationalism.
Okay, I'm actually good, thank you.
Okay, so I think we covered a wide range of territory. I'm not sure if I'm more optimistic or pessimistic to learn that these problems are not new. But I'll give the last word to Zsuzsa Csergo.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for this great conversation that was also somewhat provocative, especially when you were discussing the question of how all of this is related to regime type, democracy or not. And I'd like to remain optimistic, to take an optimistic view on what Natalie was just saying, that economic nationalism has always been around, or at least since nationalism has been around. Those of us in nationalism studies tend to agree that nationalism was not always around, but since this nation state strategy model emerged, economic nationalism has been around. And unfortunately, in the broader field of nationalism studies, it has not been given sufficient attention, I believe. So your work, Natalie and Andreas and Peter as well, and those who are focusing on this now, I think is very, very significant. And thank you so much. Thank you for moderating it, Peter, organizing it, and thank you to all of our members of the audience who have been with us. And we will see you back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yep.